Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Rules of Investing, a podcast that gets inside the minds of leading investors, economists and industry experts, brought to you by Livewire Markets. My name is Chris Conway and it's a pleasure to be hosting you. In the last episode, James Marley spoke with Seb Mullins from Schroders about multi-asset investing. Today, I'm speaking with Darren Brown from Octopus Investments Australia. Darren is the co-managing director of Renewables for Australia at Octopus. Darren will share his perspective, having worked in many parts of the energy sector over the past 20 years, talk through the development of renewables here in Australia, and highlight the opportunities for investors. If you're an Apple podcast or Spotify user, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an episode. If you are a Livewire subscriber, hit the follow button at the bottom of the wire to be notified when new episodes are available. Not a Livewire subscriber yet? Just head on over to livewiremarkets.com. It's free, easy to register, and you'll get access to the leading investment minds in the country. All right, Darren, let's get on with the show. Welcome to The Rules of Investing.
Thanks for having me.
Darren, my research tells me that you've had an extensive career in the energy sector across the entire spectrum, so oil, gas, renewables, you name it. It's probably a fairly unique perspective, someone who's seen both the fossil fuel side and the renewables side. Can you talk us through your experience and maybe some of the key learnings from those years in the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You're right. I think when I sort of sit back and reflect on my career to date, I started off in oil and gas and petrochemical, and it was a great grounding with a really large multinational company. I trained as an engineer originally before I sort of did an MBA and moved more into pure M&A and investing. And I think what I've taken away from that is that from an oil and gas perspective, they've got such a rich history in sort of knowing about systems and processes and understanding risk and how to evaluate that and think about it. And, I transitioned into renewables over the last 10 years as I've sort of moved away from the oil and gas side and realised that it wasn't where I wanted to be with my career, and I wanted to do something different. And I think what I've seen in the renewables side is that they don't have the same... they haven't been around for 100, 150 years like oil and gas has, but they're building in the same systems and processes over time. And so there's some real commonalities around how you think about big infrastructure and big projects overall, and how you think about managing risk and opportunity, and how you think about getting them built and investing in them and returns. So it's definitely been something for me where there's been a lot of synergies transitioning out of oil and gas into renewables as well. My whole career has been in energy.
Just to follow up there, if I may, and I don't want to get too controversial too early, but you said you wanted to, or you realised that maybe on the fossil fuel side, that's not where you wanted to be. Was that a philosophical thing, or was that just you could see that renewables was going to be more of a challenge? Like you said, isn't as developed, so the challenge would be greater.
Look, it's partly philosophical, but at the end of the day, fossil fuels has played a role in our lives for a long time, and it's transitioning out, which is the absolutely right thing to be doing for the planet and the environment. But also, I could just see the opportunity in Australia, where the industry had been around for a while, even 10 years ago, and was doing some great things, but it was just starting to really gain momentum. And, I was at a pivot point in my career where I thought transitioning to that and building those skill sets, because investing in renewable infrastructure isn't different to oil and gas. There are different skill sets you need to learn. And so it was the right time in my career to pivot out of that. And I think what I've seen is that, if you just look at the front page of papers, renewables is more on the front page of papers in the transition than oil and gas is these days, where if you rewind back to the early 2000s, it was all about gas, the golden age of gas, and that was the front page of the paper. So it tells you where the mindset of governments, investors and everyone is, which just makes it an incredibly exciting place to be part of and grow into.
Darren, you've talked a little bit there about how you ended up at Octopus. Can you just dive in a little bit more about the investment philosophy and, in particular, what you guys are trying to achieve for investors?
Yeah, and so I think when I transitioned into Octopus, it was I'd come out of two or three really large companies, and it's very different working in a company that's got 100,000 people globally, or a large Australian company with 10,000 employees. And when I joined Octopus now, it's almost 4 years actually to the day, we had 10 people.
Right.
And so it's such a different business. And
How many now, sorry?
55 now.
Yep.
Right. So, and being part of that scale and growth and setting that portfolio and business strategy up, along with, Sam and Sonia and others, has been really exciting. And it's the first time I've worked in what I'd call what was a small business, whilst our parent globally, Octopus Group was large and had been really successful in the UK. The Australian business was quite small. And so starting from that base with 10 people and building an investment philosophy around how we wanted to be structuring the business, how we wanted to be thinking about our portfolio of assets, was really exciting. So, the energy industry in itself is somewhat straightforward in the fact that you buy and sell energy. Energy's energy. It's not my energy is different to your energy per se.
Yep.
But how you actually think about the assets you want to create and how you want to have them work together, I think that's about the philosophy, and that's what we've been doing at Octopus, is really thinking about what are the assets we want to be buying and owning for the long term. We don't think about this over 12 months. We think about this over 30, 40, 50 years. So what are the right assets to put in the portfolio for the long term, not what will make sense for the next 12 months.
Let's shift the focus a little bit, Darren. Let's talk about the development of renewable energy in Australia. Like you were saying before, it's often on the front page of the newspaper. Where are we? Are we doing well? Are we ahead of schedule? Are we behind schedule? How are we going, and how do we compare internationally, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because you can sit there and read the media a lot on different days and different papers or different commentators who will always have an angle or a bent that they want to pursue. And Australia's set some really ambitious targets at a federal level of 82% renewable by 2030, and a lot gets spoken about that in terms of they're too ambitious. Oh, we're not going to get there, etc. We're about 40% now, but it's been massive strides that Australia's made over the last 10 years to get to that point. And the way I kind of think about it is, will we or won't we get to 82% in 2030? I don't know. But I think whenever you set targets, whether it's at a government level or a company level, they tend to be ambitious. Mm-hmm. They tend to be trying to stretch people rather than make it easy. And I think what I'm seeing is that all the right things are there in Australia to get as close to that as we possibly can. There's alignment across the states and federal governments in terms of these renewable targets. There's huge support for transmission rollout. So they're the big poles and wires that you sort of see as you're driving across the countryside. So there's a lot of alignment across government for those to be built, and a lot of them are underway. A lot of the renewable energy zones that you hear being spoken about in different parts of the country have been declared and, been said that this is where we want to build renewables. When I think about Australia, how we sit globally, compared to some other countries, we're very similar in terms of the amount of renewables that we've got. Like the renewables in Australia compared to the UK is very similar in terms of percentage rollout. We're probably slightly ahead of the US in terms of amount of renewables that we use. But one of the things that puts Australia in really good stead is that if you think about the energy market operator in Australia, the integrated system plan is what they call it. It's been really consistent for the last number of years in terms of the direction that they're taking, what they want to roll out. There's going to be delays naturally where things aren't moving as quick as what people would like, or a transition out of a coal plant isn't happening as quickly as what we would all like. But the travel of direction is consistent. And so I think that actually is one of the reasons why Australia becomes a really interesting place for people to invest, because they can see that alignment overall.
We've talked there about the human side of it. What about the natural side? Of course, the sun shining and the wind blowing. How does Australia compare? We've got a big desert right in the middle of our country. It's generally pretty hot. Are we in a prime position to be rolling out renewables and really taking advantage of our geography and weather patterns?
We really are. And so when you think about Australia, we've got such a large landmass, and the population basis in terms of where people are living compared to the landmass. It's obviously, very much on the edges from a community point of view, some inland. But some of the land holdings and land size in Australia are astronomical in terms of size. one of the recent wind farms that we opportunities that we acquired at an early stage from a land point of view is, it's on 28,000 hectares of land. And when you sort of try and put that in context, and it's a couple of hours that takes you to drive around that land with a single landowner. It's equivalent of 14,000 MCGs or something. So when you sort of try and get your head around the size of that, they're really, and it's in the scheme of land ownership in Australia, it's actually really small overall. So I think the other thing when you think about that solar and wind resource and in Australia, the big focus for Australia predominantly has been onshore wind and solar. Mm-hmm. And whilst we talk a little bit in Australia about offshore wind, and there's a couple of zones that have been declared in Victoria and New South Wales and some other states as well. It's very different compared to when you look at countries overseas that don't have that same land mass opportunity, particularly some of our Asian neighbours around, Korea and Japan and other countries, and even the UK, where they're looking to offshore wind to be able to continue to transition to renewables because they don't have the land mass that Australia does or the solar irradiance to be able to build these large onshore solar farms and wind farms. And so I think it just creates a really unique opportunity for Australia to become a superpower in renewable energy. And it's one of the reasons why I think we get spoken about, particularly about the opportunity for us to create green hydrogen and export it. And whilst I still think that's a little while away in terms of it being at that institutional scale for investment, there's a lot of interest and engagement about the opportunity for Australia to be able to create these really large onshore wind farms and solar farms to support low cost of clean green energy, to support creating hydrogen and other things that will enable exports. No different to where we were 10, 15 years ago when we created LNG plants, liquefied natural gas plants for export, which has been really important for a number of our neighbours that have used that for their energy security at the moment. And they're thinking about what they do as they transition out of that fuel in the future. And they're looking to hydrogen now, and they're looking to work with countries that have got access to that abundance of resource where they can create that energy in a stable environment and export it.
Once again, Australia's proving to be the lucky country.
Yeah, it is. It is, yeah.
What's the most exciting thing that's happened in the space in the last 12 to 24 months, Darren? Sometimes it feels as though it's moving at a glacial pace. Sometimes there's these big shunts forward in progress. I
think the things that we think about that, perhaps your average investor wouldn't think about is that the alignment on transmission build-out in the last 12 to 24 months has been enormous. The federal government announced the Rewiring the Nation Fund, which is, being managed by the CEFC, Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And that's a $20 billion fund to sort of help roll out some 10,000 kilometres of transmission line. And that new transmission is going to be critical for building all of these new renewable infrastructure. And, that alignment that happens between the states and the federal government is enabling a number of those renewable energy zones to be approved, and then, for want of a better word, early works start to build those transmission lines out. So I think that's really exciting, and it does create certainty for investors to know where to build. It's not perfect. There are complications with it, of course, but the fact that there's that alignment, I think, is really good. The other thing I'd say is, there's been some recent changes around how the energy market operator thinks about hybrid plants. So by hybrid, I mean you're combining a solar farm with a battery or a wind farm with a battery. And so, the future of energy and renewable energy is about creating firmed green energy. And, you do that by combining these renewable sources. And so by having the ability to actually create solar and batteries together in a combined manner through these rule changes that supports it is really exciting. And it's actually an area that Octopus pivoted their portfolio 2-3 years ago. So we've moved away from thinking about things in an isolated manner, and we very much thought about the integrated manner, knowing that some of these changes were going to occur. And it's actually, put us in a really good space for the next few years as well.
Darren, we'll talk more about firming in just a moment, but I just wanted to get a read on the sentiment among investors. Are people warming to this opportunity? Is there still some misunderstanding or apprehension? What are you seeing on the ground in terms of investor sentiment?
We're seeing really strong investor sentiment, and I think it sort of comes down to sort of three things. What we're seeing is that supply is continuing to come off. So by that I mean coal-fired power plants are continuing to signal that they're going to close. Mm-hmm. There might be some movement of plus or minus a couple of years, like what we've seen recently with the Eraring announcement with Origin in New South Wales. But what was really clear in that announcement, it wasn't that we're going to keep Eraring operating. We're going to just move it 2 years and then it's going to close. Yep. So it's a timing thing. And so whilst you can sit there and say, does that create uncertainty? When you've got big infrastructure, you can't lock in a date and say this is the day it's just going to happen. But the signals that are really clear from the New South Wales government and also from Origin in that is that it's going to close. Mm-hmm. And so when you've got this coal coming out, it creates enormous opportunities for renewables to step in and provide that. The other thing that is happening is that the world is becoming electrified. It was only, I think, earlier this year that the Victorian government announced that any new houses that are built in Victoria can't have a gas connection. Yeah. So where's the energy coming from? Electricity. The world is being electrified. And if you think about the transition from cars to electric cars, whilst we can talk about is it happening quick enough, what's the pace, the trajectory is one way. It's up. That's going to create demand. So, the prediction is that the view is that by 2050, energy demand will double.
Darren, I observed or read an article recently where you were on a panel and you were talking about, I think it was one of your customers or some US customers wanting to understand that the entire supply chain in terms of metal production, smelting, was green and being driven by green energy. Is that an example of, the large-scale activities that are going on where people are demanding that it be driven and powered by clean energy?
It's the absolute end goal is that we've got clean, firm, green, renewable energy and all the way through supply chains. And different industries will have different timeframes from that. Yeah. They'll have different customers that are prepared to either manage the cost for that transition or other aspects where they'll value it in a certain way. But I think the ambitions are clear that, industries are looking for clean, firmed, renewable energy. And I think the ambitions right now are probably slightly in front of what the industry can actually do. Mm-hmm. And so, but that's exciting because that means it gives you something to aim for as you're looking to create firmed green renewables. And it's exactly how we've set up our portfolio and how we think about it. So, when we look back in 10 years' time, I think what we'll see is that the transition we've made is enormous. We've hit every target along the way, maybe not, but I think we'll be amazed at where we've come from and where we've got to. Let's
talk firming up or firming, because you've mentioned it a couple of times. Just let's explain that for the viewers and the listeners. Yep. What does that mean and what are you trying to achieve there?
Yeah, it's the way I think about it is really simple. So solar energy is produced when the sun's shining. So if the sun's not shining and there's no sun, then you can't produce solar. Yep. So, that's daylight hours, right? Wind energy is a bit different. You can get all different sorts of wind energy and wind farms. The best ones are the ones that blow at nighttime. Yep. Which is like the Lacka wind farm for us, where they call it a diurnal profile, which is it tends to have less energy output during the day. And as you get into the evening, the wind really ramps up and it tends to blow harder during the evening, creating more of its energy. And then in the morning, it tends to die down. And the beauty of that is it actually works in really well with solar. Yeah. And so you've got solar during the day, you've got wind at night, but it's not firm. There's gaps, right? And so that's where energy storage comes in. Lithium-ion energy storage or pumped hydro or other forms of storage where they're not producing, they're not generating, they're not wind, they're not solar, and they're really taking otherwise spare energy in the grid, charging up a big battery, and then you're discharging that battery to really create that firming. So, the way we think about firmed renewable energy of the future is that combination of wind, solar, and storage, and really using data to understand where the best sites are and how they can work together the best to create the lowest cost of energy for the end user.
Darren, you've had a couple of big milestones recently. I'm just going to read here, make sure that I get them right. 1 gigawatt hour wind farm in Deniliquin, is that correct?
Yeah, gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts, yep.
And approval of a gigawatt scale battery in Brisbane.
Yep.
Can you just talk us through those and then maybe some other, any other exciting things that you've got going on at the moment?
Yeah, the 1 gigawatt wind farm in Deniliquin, Merino Wind Farm, was a really exciting early stage acquisition for us. It was sort of the site I was touching on earlier in this conversation. It's on 28,000 hectares of land, which is an enormous amount of land with a single landowner. We're really excited to be partnering with them. It's actually the second deal we've done with that family. Yep. As well, which sort of for us is that case of relationships are so important for everything that we do overall. And it's a project that will come to life over the next 7 to 10 years and enter into construction. And it's massive in scale. It's some $3 to $4 billion wind project. And when you think about that, it's 120, 130 of these big wind turbines, which are large in scale, right? The tip of these turbines are 250 meters in the air. Right. So think of the height of the Rialto in Melbourne overall. So it's big infrastructure over a really large part of land, and it'll power 300,000 homes. Almost 100 Deniliquins. If you think about the number of people that live there. And so that's the opportunity that it presents, and the sense it will create within communities, jobs, etc., become enormous. And then if we think about our Blackstone battery, 1,000 megawatt hours, a gigawatt hour of energy storage. For us, that's up in Brisbane. It's a really exciting project for us. It's in the heart of Brisbane, really close to what we'd call load centres. So, when you think about batteries, you want them close to where people need power, close to load, and so that they can be really responsive. These things can operate in milliseconds. Right. And so you want them really responsive, and they're there to help us create firmed renewable energy. So when we've got wind and solar happening at different times of the day and we want to be able to create that firmed energy, it's these large-scale batteries that will come in and create that firming. Blackstone will start construction late next year, which will be an enormous milestone for us overall.
Sounds very exciting. Darren, I want to talk to you about procurement. These are, as you said, massive projects. Who gets on the phone and calls Tesla and says, we want $1 billion battery, can you ship it over to Australia? What does that look like? And I think, that's the funny side of it. More importantly, like the planning that goes into these massive projects. They don't happen overnight.
No, they don't. And I think if I sort of reflect on your first question, you're asking about the commonalities between oil and gas and renewables. It's that structure and planning. Like these are really big infrastructure projects, right? They're $1 billion plus projects. So, the companies you're talking about, whether it's a Tesla or a Wärtsilä or a Vestas and other companies that we have relationships with, you've got long-term relationships with these companies. And so it's very much about partnering. And so they know who you are, you know who they are. Yep. And whilst there's a procurement process that you go through from a competitive point of view to get the best value for investors and for your project, they're long-term partnerships, because you work with these companies. If I think about a wind farm, you work with them for 30 years on maintenance, and a battery, you work with them for 20 years. So it's a really structured, diligent process where you're thinking about where is your site, how do you lay it out, what's the value this is creating? Because when we think about these things, we think about a portfolio. We don't think about an individual site. Yeah. And we keep bringing it back to how does it fit into our portfolio? What do we want it to look like? So, there's an initial call that obviously goes out and says, hi, we've just acquired this, we want to talk to you. Yeah. And then it's a bit of a journey over a couple of years when you're working through what those commercial frameworks would look like, and T's and C's. And, it feels like sometimes the development stage, the acquisition phase is really exciting. It happens quite quickly. It's normally short and intense when you're acquiring something. Yep. And then the development phase tends to be a bit longer and more methodical and diligent, and then you get into construction, and that's kind of quite exciting as well when you start building these things, yeah.
What about competition? So Australia and Octopus would not be the only centres of demand for big batteries and whatnot and turbines. How hard what's access like at the moment? Is there more demand than there is supply, and how does that affect prices, I guess?
It has a big impact, right? So I think if you think about what the challenges Australia faces are, and it's a challenge that other countries face as well, it's supply chain and labour shortage in general for people, in these really, really growing industries. So, I think transitioning people out of industries that aren't growing as fast now or don't need as many people, I think is really important to support renewables and training people. And then when I think about supply chain, in the scheme of it, whilst Australia's got an enormous opportunity in front of us, and we'll have a large amount of renewables and potentially more than what we need to meet our own base demand because of our ability to export things like hydrogen and other things, we are still a relatively small country compared to countries like China and the US and the Europe. So supply chain is really, really important. And we have seen at times, particularly over COVID, where there were some complexities in that and delays in shipping and things. But what I would say is that there's never been times when you can't actually get access to kit. So I think what we've seen is that there's been delays or extended delivery shipping timeframes on some pieces of equipment, but it's not been the case that you can't actually get access to it. And it obviously does have, the supply demand side of it does have an impact on costs of that equipment. Probably the other thing I'd add at the moment is that, particularly for storage, there's been such a large interest in electric vehicles that there's been a huge scale up of the number of factories globally that are producing batteries. And that is creating an opportunity for stationary energy storage in Australia and globally as well, because that scale up then supports better supply chain, lower costs as well. So it's a real benefit. Yeah.
Darren, a bit of a spicy one. Again, don't want to be too controversial, but you would be aware, I'm sure, of the opposition to perhaps wind farms and solar, sometimes from those in government. Are there any general messages you'd like to pass back, or are there any misconceptions you'd like to dispel, for listeners and viewers that they're seeing and hearing this commentary as well?
Yep.
And you must sit there sometimes and go, well, that's not exactly what I'm experiencing or how I view the world.
Yeah, it's always a difficult one because, again, from a media perspective, different people can take articles and choose to take different angles and different positions. I think what I would say is, in general, from the community engagement that we have within communities where we're looking at building our projects, we've got really strong engagement. There's, of course, always going to be, I think, sensitive places to look at building renewables in Australia, whether it's from a traditional owner's perspective, cultural heritage, native vegetation, ecological issues, or really close proximity to certain communities. And so I think sometimes on a case-by-case basis, you do see things not get approved, but perhaps they were also being trying to build something in an area that wasn't the right location. Yep. There's a lot of renewables that do get approved, and often they just go under the radar a little bit because they're just going through and getting approved. And so I think that's one of the things that does happen. And I think, at a government level, of course, there's obviously different views in different areas of states where there is some opposition to renewables. But overall and overarching, I think there's more support for the transition to renewables than there is people against it. And I think we've just got to keep having the right conversations around how renewables can cohabitat with communities around them, because there's a lot of long-term benefits to communities as well around, hosting turbines and wind farms and solar farms, the jobs it will create, the community benefits that it will create into the future as well as we transition away from coal.
Just one final one, Darren. It wasn't on the run sheet, but I just wanted to ask you about the coexistence of fossil fuels and renewables. It seems like that is going to be something that is going to persist for quite some time. So we know renewables is rising, and coal's not necessarily, fossil fuels are not necessarily dying immediately. It seems like that could be a 10 or 20 year journey. Is that about right?
Yeah, it is. It's exactly right. If you go and look at sort of the energy market operators, integrated system plan, they do have gas in it out for the next 20 to 30 years. Yeah. That is the reality. And I think it's, what we want to be doing is minimizing that usage, of course, but working out how we can actually transition as quickly and as practically as we can at lowest cost to consumers, and there will be some cohabitat, right? So, you can't turn off a really large coal-fired power station one day and think that the next day you have all that renewables turned on. So there's a transition that will occur over time.
I think that's investors overlook that. They're like the average man on the street, they don't understand that it's flick one switch and flick another. No, these projects take a long time to get off the ground. Yeah.
And that also creates opportunity for investors in terms of making sure that they're with the right partners, that have got the right portfolio that they're transitioning with overall. No different to a number of other markets that people would choose to invest in or be part of as well. So, we that's how we think about it. That's why we built a team of people from an energy market point of view and investment point of view that really understand that and think about it. And so you're thinking about your portfolio and how you're timing it and how you're bringing it to market.
Darren, we're at the final 3 questions of the podcast. We always ask our rules of investing guests. The first one is, can you share a story of a big win or big loss? Most people focus on the wins. What happened, what went wrong, or what went right, and what was the lesson learned?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's an interesting question. Look, I think I might focus on, it wasn't so much a loss, but it was a changed circumstances and changed outcome. It wasn't with Octopus. It was before this role, but it was a really large infrastructure opportunity, and there was an opportunity for a deal on the table to structure an investment in a certain way. Very much in a bilateral sense, and that was looked at in a certain light. And I guess the questions are asked internally: is there, is that the right or wrong deal? And maybe we should ask for something more or a different type of outcome. And I think what ensued is that perhaps sometimes, my view, my fundamental investing philosophy is time kills deals. Right. And the longer they take, the more likely you have that something changes and that landscape changes. It could be a macro factor, an economic factor. It could be actually just the people you're dealing with, something changes in their circumstances. Yep. And so, it's really important to stay focused on what is that opportunity, how does it work, and how does it add value to a portfolio? And if it makes sense, then you need to move quickly and do that deal. And this took longer than was expected, and what it did, it ended up creating changed circumstances, and it changed the landscape of how that deal was cut. And I think, people in a light of day would look back now and probably say, maybe we should have done the deal that was on the table initially rather than what was there. So it was just a bit of an insight for me, that sort of first-hand experience of realising that the grass isn't always greener, and that perhaps just you need to look at what's on the table and make sense of it. It can be done, and if you need to think about making material changes to something, then that can have consequences on it as well. And I think it's true for life as well.
Yeah, strike while the iron is hot.
Yep.
What do you think investors are getting wrong about the energy market at the moment, Darren, if anything?
I think people still talk about energy on an individual basis. They talk about a site, or I'll own so much of a solar farm or so much of a wind farm, and I'll do this and I'll be involved in it. I think the way to be thinking about energy is as a portfolio, and as a block, and how you can actually make it all work together rather than individual sites and a percentage of a site. So we spend a lot of time talking to people actually about that, and saying, well, there's one way to invest in the energy industry and to involve in renewables is to go and take a stake in a wind farm or a solar farm. Another way is to actually to work with someone that's creating a portfolio of 100% of the assets and thinking about how you can use that energy to the best benefit of consumers and investors overall. So I think that's one of the areas that perhaps people are still not focusing enough on. And it's an area we spend a lot of time talking to people about and educating them on the benefits of that overall.
Yeah. So I'll say this for you. Octopus is the only company in Australia that has a portfolio like you guys do, right? Where you're trying to integrate everything, and then you're also looking at the analytics and the data, as you were talking about earlier, and trying to map what the future of energy is going to look like, and providing that holistic investment solution. You guys, it's the only shop in Australia, yeah?
So that's exactly right we're doing. And it's an investment opportunity then at both an institutional or wholesale level to be part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how hard is that to build? If you guys are the only doing, is it you're the first mover and you're just there out in front, like are people trying to chase you? Or is it like it's the barriers to entry are great and it's unlikely that anyone's going to be able to replicate what you've achieved?
I think it's hard to say the barriers are completely, that you can't recreate it at all. But I think if you look back at it, we've created over 6 years, 7 years creating this portfolio in this team.
Yep.
And the energy transition now is in full swing. And so creating a team as integrated as ours with this view is not easy to replicate. Whether it's from the people we've hired or the culture we've created,
Yep.
It's not straightforward. And then setting up the funds, both Oasis and Oreo at a wholesale and institutional level,
Yep.
that has really got the platform there with the large institutional investors we're working with and to create this opportunity. We've built an $11 billion pipeline now of assets and opportunities. So I think it's not that someone else couldn't choose to try and replicate that, but it'll take them a long time. And we're in full swing of the energy transition at the moment. So I think we're really well placed then to capture that value for investors long term.
Yeah, that's incredibly exciting. Last one, Darren, if you had to choose an investment to stick in the bottom drawer for the next 5 years, what would it be and why?
I think it's, if I just focus on energy, I think it's a combination of data and energy markets. Mm-hmm. So technology is going to be so important over the next 10, 20 years as we transition renewables and learning how to maximize the renewable generation we've got and how to use it most effectively. And in that data and understanding weather patterns, understanding how sites operate, how different regions operate, when energy is needed to be used and why, and having technology and the people that can understand that and apply that to a portfolio in a data-driven way with technology will be incredibly important. So, opportunities to invest in companies that can do that really, really well, I think will be very exciting.
Yeah, it does sound exciting. Darren, thanks so much for sitting down with Livewire today on the rules of investing. It's been an awesome chat.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.